Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicola Barrett, Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. Welcome to today's Business Over Breakfast session, which focuses on technology and privacy. One of the things we've been busy with in executive education is working with the Goizueta Business School faculty to design new programs and learning experiences that help people like you gain the knowledge and know-how needed to help your businesses navigate through what are extraordinary times. One of these is a program and a follow-on deep dive workshop that we're offering in August about building a data-driven strategy and understanding how data and analytics are both disrupting old business models, as if we need more disruption, but also uncovering new opportunities. We're all facing so many challenges that are changing the way we're working and the issues that are consuming us. And I think it's imperative that as we move into this next phase of work and business, that we be intentional about how we do this so that we're on the best path to serve our people, our customers, and our communities. What data we collect, how we use that data is a critical area for all businesses, large and small. And today's faculty guide, David Schweidel, has pointed out that companies must make sure they're using the right data to answer their questions, and this is not trivial. It's my great pleasure to introduce David Schweidel to you. David is a professor of marketing at Goizueta Business School, and he focuses on customer relationship marketing and social media analytics. His research is fascinating and it's focused on the development and application of statistical models to understand customer behavior and inform managerial decisions. So we are in great hands today, and this is going to be a really interesting webinar. As always, we welcome your questions, and you can put them into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and the executive education team will do their best to pose these to David at the end of the session. If you want to learn more, please look into the Building a Data-Driven Strategy program and workshop that's coming up in August. And also, we'll put a link to an article that where David was featured from the Atlanta Business Chronicle. So we'll put that in the chat below. So enjoy your morning, and I know you're going to learn a lot, as I am. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Nicola, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Yeah, as Nicola had mentioned, I'm a faculty in the marketing area, and so most of the work that I do is going to be focused on how do we learn about our customers, how do we learn about the constituents that we're trying to serve, whether we're a nonprofit organization trying to be more effective at our fundraising, or we're a CPG manufacturer that wants to be more efficient in terms of designing advertising that's going to resonate with our core customer. And the mantra for several years has been, well, let's just go and collect that data. That data is the new oil. But what we're starting to see now is that we're asking more questions around, are we comfortable as consumers with the way in which technology is being used to collect the data, and then how that data itself is being used? In some sense, you can almost think about the extent to which data is being collected through our devices as creating this kind of surveillance state of sorts. Right. Just to kind of share with you an example, this is something that was discussed earlier in the fall of 2019, that Google, as well as other large organizations like IBM, are more and more interested in healthcare. There's a big market opportunity for them there. In the case of Google, it was revealed that they had partnered with an organization with a healthcare system to analyze the personal health information across a large number of hospitals, a large number of patients. And the intent here was to use their analytic capabilities to provide treatment plans, to inform doctors, to do a better job of monitoring usage of the medication that was prescribed, to inform billing behavior. But the patients themselves and even their doctors weren't notified about this collaboration. And it raises that question of, how comfortable are we with our data being used in ways that we're not aware of and that we may not have even signed up for initially. More recently, you may have seen this story. It was covered heavily in the news. I believe it was the story broke with the New York Times article about an organization, Clearview AI, that had created a facial recognition system. And what they had done was they used photos that individuals had posted on social media platforms and that the individuals had tagged themselves or their friends in those photos. And they used artificial intelligence to create a system that could more accurately take a photo of someone that was gleaned off of surveillance footage, match that against someone in their database. And this is a product that they developed and sold to law enforcement organizations. From a security standpoint, we can have the discussion of, is there a high enough need for this, whether it's policing or national security? The challenge that came into play was that, again, as users of these social media platforms where the data was, where these photos themselves were posted, we never consented to our photos being collected by a third-party organization. This is very reminiscent of what happened with Cambridge Analytica, that a third-party company went outside of what's covered by the Facebook terms of service, built an entire business on it, and started selling a product that leveraged the data that we as consumers had provided. Now, since then, regulations, or I'm sorry, about the terms of service by the social media platforms have been more stringent. More effort is being expended on monitoring the way in which this data is being used. But what we've seen just over the course of the last year or so, that those terms of service, we as consumers don't always read them, but also developers don't always abide by them. And it needs to be pointed out in many cases to the large social media platforms when those terms of service are being violated. So it's hard for them to stay on top of what's happening once the data leaves their system. The use of facial recognition, just taking that as an example, it's been deployed in a number of situations already where we may not have problems with it. The hospitality industry, particularly in Las Vegas, they innovated some of this using video cameras, using their security systems to identify people who were known cheaters in the casino, so that once they're spotted in the casino, they would escort them out. More recently, Delta and other airlines have begun testing facial recognition in the airport with the intent of providing you the ability to check in once at TSA, and then after that point, you wouldn't need to take out your boarding pass or your device again. Everything else would be done through a facial recognition scan. Some people have been comfortable with that. Others have voiced concern about that. So those are two cases where this technology is really being used already. But what if I were to tell you that retailers are thinking about doing something like this, that they're going to have, they have their security cameras set up, and it's not just a matter of saying we're going to prevent shoplifting, that we want to use them to be more effective at serving our customers. So for example, you walk into a store that you frequented many times before, and perhaps what you don't know is that there's a camera that takes your picture. And if they can recognize you, they can match your photo to all of your purchasing that you've done in the past, maybe the things that you've browsed on the website, and that information can be provided to a sales associate to more effectively serve you. Is that something that you would be comfortable with? Again, some people may say that, that if that makes the shopping experience better, we're all right with that. Other people may have concerns about their biometric information being used in that particular way. So I wanted to pose a question to everyone just to kind of get a sense for what you think about this. In terms of the city itself, which of these cities are the most heavily surveilled per capita in the US? And we'll give it a minute or so just to kind of see everything populate. There was a reporting that was done. This was done, I believe, early this fall as well. And if my recollection is correct, there's only one US city that actually shows up on the list of the top 10 as far as the most heavily surveilled cities in the world. And if we can share the results of that poll. Well, all right, so most people would say we've got a mix of fairly even tie between New York City and Washington, D.C. And that's what I think a lot of us would come to suspect, given kind of the business focus of New York, the government focus in Washington, D.C. If we take our own hometown in Atlanta, 25% of us thinking that it's Atlanta. And for those of you that thought it was Atlanta, you're right. So this was a study that was posted in The Guardian, looking at the most heavily surveilled cities per capita. So not the metro areas, but the city itself. And most of the cities that are listed here are in China. China has a very large surveillance system. They're actually testing a social credit scoring system that uses that surveillance system to capture your behavior, everything from jaywalking to helping strangers, to that information is being captured. London is on this list, but it surprises a lot of people when we see that Atlanta shows up on this list. And again, that's city of Atlanta. So we have a fair number of surveillance cameras deployed by the government in our city. And so I wanted to offer this to you, for those of you who are looking for further reading or more information on this topic. Shoshana Zuboff is a history professor at Harvard, and she had put out this book it was either over the summer or early in the fall, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it really does a deep dive, particularly around Google's activities, but it gives us a historian's take on how we ended up where we are today as far as the rampant data collection that we have. And the summary version of this is, a lot of it she traces back to the aftermath of 9/11. In that before 9/11, we had started to talk about digital privacy. We had started to talk about the extent to which there was data capture going on. And after 9/11, those concerns took a backseat to our safety. And so we went from a world where we had to say, okay, we need to balance the cost and benefits associated with data collection. Well, we changed gears and said, we're not worried about the cost and benefits anymore. We need to prevent another 9/11 type incident from happening. And if data collection can aid us in doing that, by all means, we should do that. The reason I bring that up is because we're potentially in a very similar situation today with COVID-19. There's been a lot of talk around contact tracing and using mobile devices in order to facilitate contact tracing. Google and Apple have said they're going to partner on developing a mobile app that would allow for contact tracing. And the technology today, on the plus side, exists for us to be able to use technology to accelerate how quickly we're able to identify new cases, inform the people who might have potentially been affected, and then take the appropriate action. The downside to that, though, was even if that app came out tomorrow and they assure us that it's the most privacy-friendly app imaginable, in order for it to be effective, we as individuals still have to be comfortable installing that app on our devices. So without our buy-in in order to do something like that, that app itself isn't going to be all that useful. There's been considerable discussion around this idea of, is there a right to digital privacy? Whether we're talking about the activity you conduct on your cell phones, your browsing history, and even more recently, DNA testing kits like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Well, the only right that at a national level that we actually have is the Fourth Amendment that says we're protected against unreasonable search and seizure. There are a number of criminal cases where the way in which they've been solved, these are cold cases, decades old, that have been solved by saying, let's compare DNA that was found at the scene of the crime or evidence from the crime scene to public DNA databases. And then we find a third cousin once removed, something to that extent, that we can then eventually trace back to someone who is a suspect in the case. And so in those cases, we're seeing the data that's been collected about individuals that we willingly provided for these DNA testing services, or perhaps to find long lost relatives, being used to solve crimes. We have to ask that question of, are we comfortable with that? We're seeing more frequently, what rights do we have around our online history? What rights do we have around the activity conducted on our cell phones? Just a little bit of the history here. The Supreme Court gave us a right to privacy of phone calls in 1967, so the police or government agents need a warrant in order to collect that information. More recently, and this was an incredibly important case that the Supreme Court heard about 5 years ago, that they actually recognized the importance of a digital right to privacy with regards to cell phones. And so Chief Justice Roberts had said, these are effectively miniature computers that also happen to have the capacity for a telephone call. And in his opinion, he said, they're now such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars might conclude they were an important feature of human anatomy. Right? So because cell phones themselves have evolved so much from what they originally were, the Supreme Court recognized that there's so much information there that requires special permission. It's not covered by the standard search protocols. So if you're arrested, they do not have a right to go through the contents of your cell phone. Because the court has recognized that there's so much detail of our lives contained in our cell phones. So if the police or the FBI want access to this, they need to have the permission in order to go through that. And that was really kind of the first case where we saw that nod to what could be interpreted as a right to digital privacy. Google's chief economist, Hal Varian, before he became Google's chief economist, he was a very well-regarded economics professor. But he had said, he had provided this quote, that nowadays there's a computer in the middle of virtually every transaction. And what can we do based on this? Well, we can collect and analyze data. We do a better job at monitoring, and we can get to the point eventually where we can engage in personalization and customization. Now, could be in regards to product recommendations. Those of us who are Netflix subscribers or shop on Amazon, that's what powers those recommendation systems. It's the activity that we engage in. What do we buy? What do we watch? And what have other people who have engaged in similar behaviors consumed? So a lot of the benefits that today technology delivers to us hinge on the data that we're providing. As far as companies that are engaged in this type of behavior, it runs the gamut. I've mentioned Netflix and Amazon already, Facebook and Google, other digitally native organizations where, what shows up in your newsfeed, what shows up in your search results. Well, that's going to be determined by your behavior and what you've been looking at previously. And they're going to try to figure out what's the content that is most relevant to you as an individual. In Google's mind, when you search for something on Google, it's a success to deliver that result to you on the first page in the highest position possible. If you start clicking past the first page of results, that's an indication that the results that they return to you it's not what you were looking for. And so that's like a failure on their part. So what they're doing is every action that you're taking on their platforms, whether it's Gmail, whether it's the Google search engine or YouTube, they're capturing that data to improve their algorithms. For Facebook, it's let's keep people engaged as long as possible. So let's show them posts in their newsfeed. Let's show them advertisements that are most likely to resonate with them and keep them engaged with the platform. I had mentioned casinos previously. Caesars, or I believe previously it was Harrah's, were some of the innovators when it came to customer relationship management. The thing about customer relationship management, where we used to rely solely on the data that the organization is collecting itself, there's now the potential to enrich that by saying, let's look outside of what you're doing within our four walls. Say, well, what are you doing elsewhere? What information can I collect about you from social media platforms, through mobile data that I might have access to if you've got my mobile app installed on your phone? That's information that I'm able to collect. And as I collect that, as I paint a more detailed portrait of you, it's going to tell me what's the best type of product offer, what's the right type of message to send to this individual. So lots of opportunities for us. Well, where do things potentially go badly for us? One of the areas where courts have stepped in and kind of said, wait a second, you've got to exercise a bit more care than you currently are, has to do with minors. So I've got a couple of screenshots up here around tools that were released by Facebook. There was an app called, it was essentially a marketing research tool that you could download and you would be compensated for it. I think it was $5, maybe $10 a month that you would be compensated for if you installed this app. But if we take a look at some of the finer details on this, is that you're essentially allowing the apps installed to collect a tremendous amount of data about you. And we'll get to the terms of service in a little bit, but the sticking point with this particular platform is that it was aimed at collecting information from minors. Google and YouTube ran into some issues as well because of the data collection practices that they were engaged in around advertising that was being sent to children. And so they implemented some guidelines, made some changes to the YouTube platform for content that was targeted at children. I want to just remind everyone that while a lot of what we think about when we talk about privacy, we tend to think about this as what happens online. And it's true, that is the bulk of it. But you should also be mindful that offline activity is also something that we should consider, because, and that's where there's a huge opportunity for marketers. If we can start understanding individuals' offline activity better, whether it's crowdsourcing data from Waze or Google sending out its mapping cars that have their cameras on top so that they can map out roads and ultimately provide us with better directions. We can think about it from this perspective of cost benefit. I'm an avid user of Google Maps because I have a relatively poor sense of navigation. And so I'm comfortable with that trade-off. But what if it weren't being delivered as a navigational tool? What if it was some other app or some other purpose for which all of that data was being collected? I'm not sure if I have the slides in the deck this morning, but I talk about data privacy. When I talk about it with my students, I refer to the cell phone as probably the single best data collection device imaginable. There was a series of articles in the New York Times earlier this year around just how much data is being sent off of our cell phones, how it's being collected by different organizations, and mostly by companies that none of us have ever heard of, and then being repackaged and those insights being sold, or that raw data itself being sold. And there, the concern now has shifted to, well, how do we use this data in a way that is more privacy friendly? So we started with saying, there's tremendous information here and we can get pinpoint insights. Now we're starting to say, let's pull back a little bit and say, can we still get most of those insights really without scaring consumers so much? There were several lawsuits over the past 5-10 years. A lot of children's toys, especially the connected devices, were collecting data from children and then sending that data back to the manufacturer. And I believe manufacturers were ultimately selling that information. It goes beyond children's toys. There was a smart TV manufacturer that had enabled, the default setting was to enable automated content recognition of the audio And so the reason for that is from the audio track of a television program or a commercial, it can be matched against a database and you can identify what program was being watched by a particular household or by a particular IP address. And that type of technology could pave the way for advertising to be delivered on television much the same way it is online, where we send relevant ads to you. You don't see the same ad aimed at your broad demographic group. So the intent there of delivering more relevant content to consumers could be interpreted as a benefit that we would have. But the cost of that to us is, well, a lot of data is being collected about us, and we're essentially turning on microphones that exist in the TV in order to capture this information. You know, if you've ever had that feeling of being creeped out by a recommendation on Amazon or Google where you don't remember actually searching for something, but you remember talking about that, and if you've got Alexa or Google Home, if you've ever had those concerns, well, this is the same thing, only it's happening through our television, right? And so that, again, brings us to this question of consent, and did we provide it? And let's do another quick poll of, do you believe that that you've consented to data collection? So yes, no, or to some degree. And we'll give it just a minute or so for folks to kind of share their thoughts on this. Okay. But yeah, this is a tricky issue for us because we are presented frequently with terms of service, or we think if we recall them, we might remember being presented with them. And let's take a look at what those results show from the poll. Yeah, so most of us would say to some degree that we provided consent. Almost 2/3 of people say that we provided consent, and yeah, I suspect the kind of ambivalence in some sense that we have around that is we remember clicking something, but there's a question of, did we actually read it? And to what extent did me clicking that give the consent that's necessary to engage in a lot of what's happening today? Yeah, again, we're all familiar with the terms of service, but even the FTC chairman at one point had said, we all agree that consumers don't read privacy policies. All right, so what's the point in having a privacy policy that us as consumers aren't reading? This was a couple of years ago that there was a study conducted at Carnegie Mellon that calculated how long it takes to read a terms of service, how many of those terms of service you actually encounter over the course of the year. And what they concluded was, in order to read all the terms of service and comprehend them, that it would take the average person 76 work days at an opportunity cost of just over $750 billion in order to actually read the terms of service. But yeah, these are the guidelines. This is what we're agreeing to. So this is saying, here's what the company can do with this data. Here's what I understand they're collecting. Here's how they can use it internally. Here's how they can use it from an external standpoint. And the terms of service are so dense that we've essentially opted into things without actually processing what that means. Now, in specific industries, regulations might be more stringent for example, regards to healthcare, financial services. Yeah, anyone who has taken out a mortgage or refinanced recently, you're aware of the full stack of documents that you get to sign, as well as kind of the quick summary of, here's how much it's going to cost you over a period of time. Credit card users get month or annual privacy statements. We have to sign forms at the doctor's office consenting to certain things. But in the online space, we don't have the same level of kind of required comprehension in order to consent to using a platform. Where this really started to take a turn was in the EU, where individuals had argued that they wanted results left out of Google search results. They essentially wanted a right to be forgotten. And these were just a couple of the examples that citizens had sent to the Spanish Data Protection Agency about results they wanted excluded. For example, a woman who had been abused by her ex-husband didn't want him to be able to find her address, so she wanted to be left out of those results. People who are older didn't want stories coming out about them from their college years or financial distress that they had gone through. So what I think a lot of us would consider legitimate grounds for being able to kind of maintain some privacy around things. It went in Spain. Yeah, this was passed that it found that the search engine has to consider the protection of personal data. So that it cannot be that we go out and we collect all this data and we just put it out there and we have no liability from it, that they have to allow people to opt out of having kind of that spotlight shown on all of their past activity. And as you could imagine, Google's CEO at the time was not thrilled about this. He had argued that having data collected by companies like Google was better than the government because they care so much about their reputation. I'll let everyone draw their own interpretations about kind of the veracity of that claim. So that was one country, one incident of saying, okay, well, we're going to acknowledge that there's a right to privacy. Fast forward a few years, and where might things potentially go off the rails? Well, Cambridge Analytica was one of these examples. I just watched the Netflix documentary, I think it was called The Great Hack, talking about this incident, and there are books that have been written on it already. But essentially, people took a quiz on Facebook. Facebook kind of wasn't as vigilant as necessary to make sure that the data was not being used in ways that it wasn't supposed to be, and that resulted in almost 100 million users having their data exposed and it being used for political purposes. Right. So probably not how, when the idea of people being connected on Facebook, sharing information with their friends, that now having that data about them weaponized for persuasive purposes and used in the political process is probably not what we envisioned when we said, yes, I allow Facebook to collect this data and installed a personality quiz. The other aspect of it that I think is worth mentioning, Cambridge Analytica is the most recent example. But I would argue some of what's happened on Facebook and other online platforms is potentially even more concerning. Facebook and in particular has run a number of experiments where they kind of manipulate the content that is on their website to measure the behavior that people engage in. So Facebook changing the way in which the messaging around today is election day, did you vote, actually had can have a positive impact on people turning out to vote. Facebook's goal, let's be clear, is Facebook we think of as a social network. Facebook is an advertising platform. Their goal is to keep you on the website as long as possible so that we're in a position to be able to serve you more ads and generate more revenue. Right? That is their business model, is to serve ads. Well, the other study that Facebook engaged in was one where they tweaked the content in user news feeds to say, okay, do I show more positive emotional content or do I show more negative emotional content? And what impact does that have on the people who are being exposed to that? Well, it turns out if you're shown more negative content, you actually tend to express more negative content online. So that small experiment is actually changing the emotions that we express and potentially the emotions that we experience. So we're moving not just from a surveillance state, but into the realm of social engineering. And that's something that I think should give all of us pause, because if we're aware of what these websites are doing, that's one thing. But if you're not aware of it, your mood is potentially being influenced. Your decisions to purchase things are being influenced. Your opinions are being formed by these algorithms that we may not have been paying attention to. Right? Instagram had recognized this and realized kind of the pressure that's on individuals created by the number of likes that their photos get. I don't think I put it in here, but there was a story, I believe it was in the Washington Post this winter, looking at it from a teenager's perspective. And the summary of the story was essentially that teenagers evaluate to some extent kind of their self-worth by the reactions that their peers have to what they post online. Did this post get enough likes? Or, I said this, oh no, not enough people liked it, so they think that they don't like me anymore, and depression sets in. And so now the platforms are starting to look at that a little bit more closely. Celebrities weren't thrilled with that decision because it upends the influencer business model. So that we have a tension between the social well-being and then the core business model itself. One thing for us to think about is when we're talking about data collection and the deployment of analytics, government doing this is one thing, businesses doing it is another thing. Do we think about these the same way, or are there cases where we might be comfortable with one group doing, or one set of organizations doing something, but not comfortable with others? So, for example, going back to the aftermath of 9/11, the government had said, we need to prevent this from happening. We need to collect data in order to do this. Would we feel the same if it was, from a commercial standpoint, the businesses that we choose to conduct business with, saying, let's say Amazon decided we want to extend our reach, we want to get deeper and more embedded in people's lives, and we're going to do whatever is necessary to do that. We might react differently coming from a private industry versus government choosing to mandate something. Right. So now that we've talked about the potential issues with having all of our data out there, what does it look like to have reduced privacy? As I'd mentioned, I'm not going to play through the video, but there were several stories around China's social credit system. And this uses the surveillance system to say, who is this particular individual? What is the activity that they're engaging in? And let's track that person. If you do something that's considered good, it's going to benefit you. If you do something considered bad, it's going to adversely affect you. So let's take a quick poll. In broad strokes, the idea of a social credit system informed by surveillance cameras and your actions. Do you approve of having a system like that in place? And to give you some context, those people who have really good social credit scores, they get favorable rates to loans. They're able to get admitted to the best schools. They're able to travel. Whereas if you have a negative score, for example, you could be prohibited from buying a plane ticket to travel. All right. So let's just see what the early responses to the poll were. So overwhelming response saying, no, I'm not comfortable, or I don't approve of such a system. Well, might surprise us, but 80% of the Chinese approve of the social credit system, or at a minimum, when asked about this, they say that they approve of this system. So one factor that may be coming into play here are cultural differences that exist. Where in the US we have been very much focused on the individual rights, individual freedoms. Other cultures, that may not be as much a driving factor. And the idea of a surveillance system that kind of informs about society and helps to steer society may not be seen as a bad thing. All right. All right, so let me share with you just another case of where reduced privacy could come into play. These are examples of loan applications from a peer-to-peer lending site. They're both asking for the same amount, same terms on the loan, 3 years, 7.8% interest, and they both have an A rating by this peer-to-peer platform, which basically translates to our credit scores. The only thing that's different between these two applications is the language that they use in terms of asking for the loan. And as it turns out, the language that we use is very informative of things. Borrower 1 is 8 times more likely to default on the loan than borrower 2. And as I mentioned, that's being informed solely by the language that they used. So this was a study done by a faculty member and a team at Columbia University, where they said, well, let's take the people who default on loans, let's identify the language that they use more so than the people who do not default on loans. And I believe I have some of the illustrations. I believe the illustrations, it's essentially people who, in their language, they exhibit traits indicative of deception and extroversion. And so the takeaway from this is that how we say things, how we write things can inform above and beyond demographic information in particular outcomes. And this raises a question for us, because the larger financial institutions have very strict guidelines around what they're able to use in making their lending decisions. But peer-to-peer platforms like this, they may have more lax guidelines that they have to follow. But where does the text that we're using come from? Is that a conscious choice that we're making, or is that part of our upbringing? Is that part of kind of where we're from, or our family's background? And if that's the case, the language that's used, the word choice that we have, how we phrase things, may be related to ethnicity or kind of regions where you grew up. And if that's the case, using language to distinguish between giving someone a loan versus not giving them a loan, well, using that language, what you're effectively doing is saying, I'm going to discriminate against people based on how they were raised. And that's something that personally just doesn't really sit right. So on the one hand, from the pure data standpoint, it's more accurate. There is information contained in the text. But just because that data is there, is this a way that we should be using that information? And that's a question not just for financial institutions, but that's a question for all organizations. Should we be collecting this data? And should we be using data in this way? And we've got to think about that, again, not just from the standpoint of what's the impact on the bottom line, but is that a positioning that we're comfortable with? And what would our consumers, how would our consumers react to that information? I did want to share with you, as we're talking about algorithms, kind of institutionalizing some of the biases that may exist. This is something that is being discussed at great length. We think that if we take the human out of the decision-making, we're going to take some of the biases out as well. And that's not necessarily the case. So up on the screen, you'll see a couple of different examples of how artificial intelligence essentially instituted the biases that were held. In these cases, looking at hiring practices, it started discriminating against women. And I wanted to unpack for you why that's happening. If we take the case of using Google Images to look for pictures of CEOs, well, artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, all of these tools rely on finding patterns, right? And so in order to find that pattern, I'm going to look at the search term, I'm going to look at historic search results and what has shown up previously, what have people chosen to click on, and that's what I'm more likely to return. Well, if you're searching for images of CEOs, well, how many women are CEOs of major organizations. It's a relatively small number. And so if we were just to say, turn the algorithm loose and say, find pictures of CEOs for me, by and large, the search results that you're going to get are pictures of male CEOs. Similar thing happens if you're using AI as a hiring tool. So take Amazon using this for hiring purposes. So they start screening people. And this is something that's becoming increasingly common. I've had a number of students tell me that they're prepping for their video interview where they answer a series of questions, they record the video, they upload it, and that's the first round interview that they have. And only those who do sufficiently well progress to the next round. Well, again, let's look at tech companies. Historically, tech companies have been disproportionately male employees. If you start looking for patterns of who have my successful employees been historically, well, if most of your employees are men, chances are the ones who have been successful, most of them are going to be men. And so when you try to build this into an algorithm, what it's going to look for is, well, what's the pattern that predicts success? Oh, it looks like gender's one of the key predictors. So even though we didn't tell the system, look for gender, it's looking for patterns that exist historically. So this is something that has to be actively countered. All right, so this is gender-based discrimination. Algorithms are all, similar problems in terms of race. This has been especially pronounced when we talk about facial recognition software. Facial recognition software has primarily been trained on white men. Well, if you're looking at women, you're looking at minority groups, it's not going to do nearly as good a job. You see some examples here of object recognition or computer vision tools that don't do the best job of accurately picking up what is in the picture. All right, so in that way, we've got to be mindful that we don't allow algorithms to institute racism because of the data that we're using to train them. Right? And so one of the things that has to happen is a shift in our mindset. For years now, I've heard this analogy, data is the new oil. And there's a lot that I like about that statement, because oil itself, at least for us as consumers, raw oil, if I have a barrel of petroleum sitting in my backyard, doesn't do me much good. But if that oil goes through a refining process, it can be turned into something that has tremendous value to me. And data is the same way. If I collect data, it's a bunch of ones and zeros. But if I put it through an analytic process, I can turn it into insights that I can use to drive my business forward. That is the benefit of it. All right. Well, the question we should be asking ourselves is, do we need all of that data? Right. Let's start thinking about data collection in terms of assets and liabilities. In the strictest sense, any data that you collect that you're not using is a liability, because it's data that you've collected that you have to store, you have to protect, you have to make sure that it's not accessed illegally. And if you don't have a plan to do anything with it, that's a data breach waiting to happen. On the other extreme is data that's collected with purpose, that we can think about, and this is a project that we're currently working on, but you can think about, what is the change in my organization's value that can result from my collection of this data, right? I know I can think about, how much is it going to cost me to get the data? How much is it going to cost me to secure it? How much is it going to cost me to do the analysis? How much is it going to cost me to deploy the results of that analysis? And how is that going to translate into growth of my organization? So if we can think about it as data enabling the growth of the organization, all right, I know what the benefit is. Now let's balance that against the cost, part of which is the potential for a data breach. Right? And so as we encourage organizations to kind of think about their data collection practices, these are a couple of principles that all organizations should have in mind. First is moving to more of an opt-in framework rather than an opt-out framework. In a number of cases, you have to agree to the terms of service in order to be able to use a tool. well, can we move to a world where it's opt out by default? You know, that where I can still use the tool without sharing all of my data. Or do we want something where it's, you know, where it's a smaller number of individuals who are willing to opt in, but it's a more loyal audience. It's an audience that is very supportive of what the brand, what the organization is trying to do. So just forcing everyone into something by default and then making them jump through hoops in order to opt out of it, yeah, that's not something that consumers find particularly endearing. And also with pending legislation as well as draft legislation, this is a direction that we're going to see more likely than not implemented in the near future, is that consumers have to have a very easy ability to opt out. It can't require, 10 phone calls and constant vigilance in order to opt out of something. Another aspect is transparency. We talked about this with regards to terms of service, that it's so complicated. We get so bogged down in the details that we've decided to say, you know what, we're just not going to read it. In my ideal world, you should be able to tell people what data you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, and who is it staying inside the organization or does it have to go outside the organization? Not too many questions, but it's something that it's information that needs to be conveyed to people when they're making that decision, not 20 pages of terms of service. What I just said, that's something that could be put into an infographic and put on a single screen, and it allows people to quickly understand what are the broad strokes of what they're agreeing to. The other element that I would encourage organizations, both nonprofits and as well as traditional corporations, to think about is, what is the data that you actually need, right? Instead of saying, I'm going to collect everything and I'll figure out what to do with it later, let's invest that time up front to say, what's the decision I'm trying to make? What's the data that's going to allow me to make that decision? So what's the analysis that I need? What's the data that's necessary to support that analysis? And more likely than not, it's going to be a fraction of the data that you would have collected otherwise. All right, so with that, again, thank you for taking the time this morning, and I think we've got a couple of minutes for Q&A.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, David. That was great information. One of the first questions asks, what 3 things do you do on your phone or computer to minimize others' ability to track you?
So I'm not all that concerned about people tracking me on my phone because I don't think my life is all that interesting. Yeah, I've got 2 small children at home, so my routines are pretty predictable based on them. But if it's something that's of concern to you, the biggest thing is it's the permissions that you allow. So I would go through all the permissions on your phone and make sure that you're allowing those permissions while you're actually using the app. And not allowing them to kind of run in the background or anything more generous than is absolutely necessary for the app to run. Another thing that you can do to be careful about it is when you connect to Wi-Fi networks in public places, often you're sharing information when you do that. So I would not bother doing that. I would simply rely on your cell signals rather than trying to use those Wi-Fi networks if it can be avoided. And I'm also just I'm selective in terms of the apps that I install. I don't download a whole lot of apps. Yeah, again, I've got navigation apps, I've got finance apps. It's things that I use with a fairly high degree of frequency. I would be careful when you download apps about the permissions that they're asking. Developers have gotten better about this over the years, but at a point, there was a flashlight app was the most popular app in the App Store, and that flashlight app was essentially scraping your entire Facebook profile, required you to log in on Facebook, share your contacts with them, everything else. It's just not necessary. So like something like Uber needs to know my location in order to function. Something like a retailer doesn't necessarily need my location. If I want to play a video game, again, it doesn't need my location. It doesn't need my friend information. It doesn't need my cell phone contacts. And so those kind of things, if you don't need it, I just wouldn't install them.
Thank you, David. You mentioned that we need to consider questions if we're going to collect data. Whose responsibility is it to do this? Is it the C-suite, the chief marketing officer? Should companies hire a chief privacy officer?
That's a great question. We're actually starting to see companies hire, I don't know if they're calling them chief privacy officers or if it's a slightly tweaked title, but if that's effectively what they are. And this is hugely important with CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act coming live and compliance with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, in the EU. Companies are investing significant amounts to ensure that they're in compliance with these laws. So for organizations that can afford it, having someone whose sole purpose is privacy, and that could be a chief data officer, where that person's tasked with, both, there's the compliance with the law aspect, and then there's also kind of the data storage and security aspect. So in a lot of cases, these are things that may fall to the CIO to make sure that the data is secure. And then it's like, okay, well, this has to do with the data, so that's the responsibility of the CIO. My sense, though, is that this is a little bit outside of the traditional expertise of the CIO. And so, when it's feasible, having a chief privacy officer is a really good idea.
David, and I think we have time for one more.
All right.
For this last question, it says, when Instagram went away from using numbers in their likes, celebrities boycotted and went to YouTube channels. Do you think this will be an industry trend based on the emotional data that's been found?
I hope it becomes an industry trend because we are seeing significant impact that the significant impact that social media platforms have, especially on minors. And so if obscuring those numbers, I don't know if we need to go entirely away from having some report of popularity, but I just think we've got to do a better job in terms of how this information can be used. Yeah, if removing the numbers works, I understand from the business standpoint, kind of the celebrities and influencers saying, okay, well, we're going to leave the platform because of this. And we're going to allow the markets to speak in some sense. We're going to see how many of those people migrate off of the platforms that take these steps. But I think it's going to have to be something where government agencies get involved at some point, because we are talking about kind of the well-being of people. And this is something that there are long-term studies that have been launched, I believe, by the NIH to look at the impact of technology, to look at the long-term impact of technology and social media. And we've only got preliminary evidence so far, but my suspicion is that we need more oversight around this. And if the company, for the companies themselves to implement that oversight may go against their business model. So that's why I suspect we're likely to see regulations down the road.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David, for this wonderful topic this morning. And we want to thank you all, our wonderful attendees that come back every Thursday to check us out for our Business Over Breakfast webinar series. This recording of this particular webinar will become available on the Emory Executive Education LinkedIn page. That specific link is located in the chat box listed there. Also, as Nicola mentioned in the beginning of our webinar when she kicked off, David Schweidel, along with some other world-renowned Goizueta faculty, are going to be leading an executive education short course in August called Building a Data-Driven Strategy. Again, information and registration for that is also located in the chat box. The link is listed there. Next week, we'll be returning on June 25th, same time, 9 a.m. Eastern, with leading remote teams during a crisis with Goizueta faculty member Peter Topping, and also Tom Smith will be returning at the top of July with the Economy and Me. So we hope that you all will join us for those sessions. In just a moment, you're going to notice a short survey pop up on your screen. We just ask that you take a couple of moments to fill out that survey for us. Give us some feedback on the session today. We'd really appreciate that. And again, as always, thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all next Thursday at 9 a.m. Have a great, great day.